This movie is on database functions. It's on 10 database functions, but the good news is that once you understand how to set up and define the arguments for one of these functions, you can set up all of them. So database functions allow you to identify a data list, which could be a table of information, a table of data, a field for which you want to retrieve the value from, and then you set up a criteria range that includes the column headers, and then you define a value for those fields, and the database functions will aggregate the amounts in the selected field for the records that match the criteria. Showing you is a lot easier than explaining it, and so that's what we're going to do. So database functions. I've right justified all the database functions in the arguments in column B to make a point, and that is that all of the arguments for each one of these database functions are the same. So if you can set up one of these database functions, you can set up any of the database functions. That being the case, we're going to set up the dsum function and explain it, and once you understand that, you can use any of these functions. So there are three arguments for the database functions. One is the database, the second one is the field, and the third is the criteria range. So I want to go to cell D5 and input a dsum function equal dsu tab. And as I said, there's three arguments we need to define for these database functions. The first is the database. This could be a region that contains data, a data list, a table, and for us it's this region that contains a data list with some made-up sales data, comma. The next argument is the field that you want to retrieve the value for. Now in this data list we have three fields that contain values: the quantity, the price, and the extended total. What I want to retrieve is the extended amount, the extended total, and to define that I select the column header for that field, comma, and the last argument that we need to define is the criteria range. Now I have a criteria range that I'm going to define with the column headers that's going to make up the first row in the criteria range, followed by one or two or more cells that I choose to include in the range below the column headers. Now this criteria range I just happen to put above the database itself, but you don't have to do it this way. This criteria range can exist on another worksheet. So since I've defined a criteria range, but I haven't established any criteria, the dsum function should sum all the values in column N, which is the extended field in the database. And when I enter, I get the total of $607, which is the sum of all of those values in column N for the extended field. So I have a criteria range set up over here, and I said I haven't established any criteria, but I actually have. Since I didn't define any of the field values, the criteria is open-ended and it's pulling in all of the field values. And this is something to keep in mind, because what the database functions do is match up the criteria from the criteria range, and it looks for those values that you've defined as the criteria. So let's say I want to pull out all of the sales or sum all of the sales for Bob. When I enter, nothing's changed. I still have the dsum function returning a result of 607, which is all of the records. That's because the way the criteria works is that currently the dsum is looking for values in the salesman field that equal Bob and equal the non-defined criteria, which is the current cell that I'm in, I7, and so it sums up everything for Bob and everything for everybody else. If instead I enter a blank character space into that second criteria spot and enter, now the dsum returns the total in the extended field for all the records for which the salesman either equal Bob or a blank character space, which in effect returns the sales for Bob, because there are no blank character spaces in the database for the salesman field. So that brings us to another point. The criteria range is cumulative when you're working your way down. I've defined the salesman to be either Bob or a blank character space. And the way that's treated with the database functions is that it's either Bob or the blank character space. So if I make it Bob or Joe, so I actually have defined two salesmen, enter, the dsum function should return the extended values for all of the sales for Bob and Joe. If we're working our way across the criteria range, the database function processes the criteria defined as an and rather than an or. So we have Bob and sales that took place for, let's say, product 1, or it will look for Joe's sales. So manually summing this up, the criteria that we've established is sales for Bob for product 1, which is here, holding down the control key, and here, and all of the sales for Joe, which are in these cells. And the total is $223, and that's what the dsum function returns. So we can, of course, further refine the criteria by selecting the sales for Bob for product 1 that took place in the southern region, and all of the sales for Joe. Entering, the dsum function returns a value of 134, which should be just all of Joe's sales, and that's what it is. And of course, we can refine the criteria for Joe and have the total sales for Joe for product 1 in the same way that we define the criteria for Bob's sales to be product 1 for the southern region. Entering, we get 50 because there's only one sale for Joe for product 1, and it's right there. And there are no sales for Bob for product 1 in the southern region. So when you're defining a criteria, working your way down the column, think of it as or. We're looking for sales for Bob or Joe. When you're working your way across the criteria range, think of it as and. So the current criteria is that we're looking for Bob sales, and it has to be Bob sales for product 1, and it has to be Bob sales for product 1 that took place in the southern region. Or we're looking for Joe's sales, and it has to be Joe's sales for product 1. So there's a lot of flexibility in defining the criteria when you're retrieving values from a data list or a table. And like I said, if you can set up one of these database functions, you can set up any of the database functions, because the functions are just a different way to aggregate the values in the selected field. So there are other ways to define the criteria values. I'm going to delete the criteria we've set up so far, and we're going to begin again by having a criteria defined as all the sales that do not equal Bob's sales. Entering. Once again, since the second space for the criteria for the salesman is open-ended, we're getting all of the sales. That's why the dsum is returning $607. To fix that, I'm going to put a space, enter, and that value, $337, should be all of the sales for everybody but Bob, and that's what it is. We can also use wildcards. So if I have an asterisk, which should give me everything, I'm back to $607. So the wildcard works sort of as an open-ended invitation for all the records to be aggregated. We can put product 1, and I should have all the sales for product 1 from any salesman. Manually checking that out, it would be here, 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 and the total, as we see on the status bar, is 160, and that's what the dsum function is returning to us, is 160. And if I get all of the sales for product 1 that were not sold by Bob, it should be 71. It should be this value and this value. So I can go back up here and set the criteria to not equal Bob, enter, and the dsum returns 71. So once again, there's a fair amount of flexibility with the database functions. When you're defining the value for the criteria for the records in the selected fields, when the database functions are aggregating the value in the field that contains the value that you want to aggregate. So that's the database functions. The database functions all have the same arguments. There's three. First, you define a database, and then you define the field that you want to retrieve the value for by selecting the column header, the name for that field, and then you define a criteria range that has in it, in the top row, some of the column headers that exist in the database, and below that, values that you define that become the criteria for those particular fields, so that the database functions will retrieve and aggregate the values that match the criteria you've established for those fields that are part of the records contained in the database.